Thank everyone for coming today. My name's Ted Fisher. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies. It's always a treat to do events here in the library, and we'd like to thank Valerie Hotchkiss and the wonderful staff. You've really, over the last few years, made this a wonderful place, the intellectual heart of campus. So Jason De León, our guest today, first came onto my radar a couple of years ago when his book, The Land of Open Graves, was published. It won virtually every award that anthropology has to offer, every single one after another. And being a good contrarian academic, that made me skeptical of what was, the value of this book. But, and those of you who are students I'm pulling the curtain back a little bit, but I assigned it in my 101 class because I wanted to read it, and assigning a book in a class moves it to the top of the stack by my bedside table. And it turned out to be this powerful account of life at the border that combines the facts about what's going on. We hear so much rhetoric about migration these days over our southern border. Combine the hard facts with what's going on with a real human understanding of the lives of the people who are crossing. Many of us in anthropology would like to do consequential sorts of research, would like to do research that's engaged in public debates. Jason De León is one of the few who actually does that. His work on the program Prevention Against Deterrence, for example, I was telling him on the way over here, actually, it's more relevant today than when you wrote that 3 or 4 years ago, unfortunately. Now, we are at a university. I would assume that most of us in this room assume ourselves to be geniuses. Jason is a MacArthur certified genius, so it takes it up a different level. He's professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, soon to be professor of anthropology at UCLA, his undergraduate alma mater. And he was telling me this morning he's actually going back, he's moving into the lab, the very lab where he studied as an undergraduate, now as a senior professor. Jason is also the founder and director of the Undocumented Migration Project. We always, when people do incredible work like he did in the Land of Open Graves, we invite them here to talk about that work. But like a good intellectual, he's deep into his next project. And so what he's going to talk to us about today is an equally fascinating project, Soldiers and Kings, Violence, Masculinity, and Photoethnographic Practice in the Context of Human Smuggling Across Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Jason De León.
Could we dim the lights just a little bit? Is that possible? Oh, thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't start this talk off quoting from my favorite musician, Jason Isbell, who apparently told me on Twitter that he couldn't come to the talk, but I appreciate the fact that he at least responded to me on Twitter. Yeah. It's usually a one-way conversation on Twitter, but occasionally he will respond back. But and I think this quote really does sort of set up much of what I'm going to talk about today. And I just want to thank you all for having me here. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be here in Nashville, to be talking about things that are sort of on the political radar once again as we're coming out of an election cycle and approaching another one. I'm thinking about Central America and smuggling and MS-13 and everything else that's currently coming out of the current administration's mouth. So yeah, this is an ongoing book project. Soldiers and Kings. You want to make a picture of this? That's what Warlock keeps asking me. You want to make a picture of this? A small flame materializes and begins to warm a crack rock that's cradled in the contour of a repurposed aluminum beer can. He takes a hit and releases a powdery cloud, but he tilts his head away from me slightly so that the smoke doesn't go right into my face. Go ahead, take a picture, Warlock says. In English, that's an accented hybrid of the Bronx and Honduran Garifuna, Afro-Honduran. Yo, I got a lot of these pictures already, man, I say to him. This is kind of boring, taking pictures of you smoking crack. Ha ha ha, he says. This shit's crazy, and he points at the crack rock, but it relaxes me. And I say, man, but you keep complaining about not being able to sleep at night. You think maybe it's all this cocaine? He smiles at me like he always does, and he says, maybe. Warlock is a funny and incredibly complex dude. A former child soldier in the Honduran military who migrated to the United States as a teenager. Now in his early 30s, he learned English while incarcerated for almost a decade in the States for a series of violent felonies. Once paroled, he started doing dirt in Mexico: robbery, assault, drug dealing, and worse. If you ask him, though, he'll tell you that he prefers smuggling his fellow Hondurans. It's safer, it pays better, and is less stressful. Smuggling people gives him less nightmares than the other stuff, the crazy stuff. No hay problema, toma unas fotos, bro. Take some pictures, firme, bro, firme. Every other word is bro. After months of this, I am now expected to always be taking pictures. The sparse room that we sit in is lit by a bare light bulb and the pulsing television. I'm shooting at 6400 ISO, pushing the film, yes, film, 4 stops with my aperture set to 1.2. Click wind, click wind, click wind, click wind. I'm following him around with his film camera. But shooting with film means not getting distracted by staring at the back of the camera, what digital photographers call chimping, right? You take a picture and you go, ooh, ooh, and, or do it again, be more natural. Shooting with film doesn't allow me to do that. You just keep shooting and you find out later on if you've captured something interesting from that particular moment. Tupac Shakur rattles out from the room directly below us. His voice is mixed with the cackling and the shit-talking that accompanies the slamming of dominoes onto a table. Warlock's soldiers are partying downstairs. It's always College Friday here in the safe house, especially right now because business is so slow. This is right after the 2016 election. Pinche Trump, goddamn Trump. Nobody wants to come right now because they're afraid they'll all get deported right away, is what they all say. Still, even when there are clients to move, there's a whole hell of a lot of drinking, smoking, and partying. It's the same scene every night. I take pictures of these guys partying, and so do they. Portraits, selfies, Snapchats, Facebook Live. I have enough images to make a multiple volume book about this everyday practice. But there's really nothing sensational about this behavior. Nobody's out of control for the most part. Everyone keeps it together or they get dealt with by Warlock. Like, be on your best behavior. For people living this close to the edge of death, the excessive consumption of drugs and alcohol is an absolute necessary evil. You need it to relax, Warlock assures me. And it's true. He seems much calmer and less stressed out once the cocaine appears. It's a poor man's Xanax after a hard day at work. I snap a picture of Priest as he exhales. He turns and he stares at me. And over the years, I've learned to be not just slightly afraid, but oftentimes to be quite afraid of those who don't say anything but just stare at me. Don't worry about that dude. He don't say shit, but he a good soldier. He a good soldier, Warlock repeats as he points at Priest. He says, I've known that dude for a long time. He's from one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in San Pedro Sula. And then he gets close to me and he whispers, he's fucking crazy. I'm like, man, oh, he's crazy. That's when you know you're in trouble, when someone gets close and whispers that to you. You're like, oh my God. But what he means by good soldier is that he can ask Priest to do his bidding with no questions asked. By, quote, fucking crazy, he means that Priest is someone who can be relied upon to do the most serious jobs required by the gang, which oftentimes means killing someone for money. There's always at least one priest in every single crew. When I like Priest, he seems to be incredibly fascinated by me. He loves posing for the camera. Head tilted back, eyes half shut, smoke billowing from his mouth like some kind of demon. He's got menacing down to an art. But I can't publish the bulk of those portraits. The most intense individuals in this community, the most violent, are the ones that I have to photograph in the shadows or as unidentifiable silhouettes. Shooting indoors with poor lighting makes people appear more looming and ominous. And I worry about images of young black men cast in dark shadows, engulfed in plumes of marijuana and crack smoke. Potential racial stereotypes and photoethnographic practice constantly collide head-on in these encounters. But still, Warlock and Priest and a lot of his soldiers, they like it. It adds to the persona that they themselves try to publicly cultivate in their own social media. They love it when I can make them look terrifying. In the increasingly violent world of human smuggling across Mexico, Good smugglers or guides, guias, they either need to be crazy or have to have soldiers underneath them willing to do whatever it takes to protect that precious, precious cargo, human cargo. Gone are the days where someone could set out on their own from Central America and hitch a free ride on the Mexican freight trains known as La Bestia. Those days are over. The transnational gang Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, they control large sections of the migrant trail that cut across Mexico. Mexican drug cartels control key geographic points in the country. And so now migrants from Central America must pay a quota to both of these groups numerous times, or they risk robbery, kidnapping, or something much more grave. The safest and best guides at the moment are those with a gang affiliation, either MS-13 or some other transnational gang, 18th Street, Southsiders, Crips, Bloods, pick your poison. If you want to guarantee your safety while traveling, well, you better hire someone like Priest to guide you. And Warlock and others, they estimate that the vast majority of guides now moving across Mexico are associated with MS-13 in some way, shape, or form. Thus, if you want to understand human smuggling in this current moment, you have to look at the complicated, difficult, and dangerous lives of these gangbangers who largely control the market. This is why I find myself in a dank cement room on the outskirts of Mexico City in a place called Lecheria, with Warlock, Priest, and the rest of his crew. Since 2015, I have been trying to figure out, and understand what the daily lives of smugglers, both these low-level soldiers and crew leaders, what their lives are like, and represent those experiences using a combination of text and images. And today in this talk, I'm going to try to answer a couple of simple questions. One, how is human smuggling across Mexico currently structured in this modern era? And second, what do I gain by deploying a camera in this incredibly challenging ethnographic context? And what can be learned by reflecting on my own photoethnographic practice in this work? But before I can do that, I just have to give you a little bit of a history lesson on Mexican immigration enforcement over the last couple of years. And that all starts with Plan Frontera Sur. Plan Frontera Sur was announced in July of 2014 by the Mexican government. And you might remember right around this time was the first time in my memory where I could really imagine the American public being concerned about migrants. Because you had on the front page of the LA Times and the New York Times, hundreds of kids in overstuffed detention cells freezing to death in places like El Paso and Nogales. And America was suddenly realizing that we have this humanitarian crisis happening at the border. And then suddenly that all went away. The Obama administration came out and said, we have secured the border, we have fixed this problem solved, et cetera, et cetera. But we actually hadn't done much at the US-Mexico border. Very little had changed at this moment. What ended up happening was that we put an enormous amount of political and economic pressure on Mexico to solve our immigration problem, to stop these kids from coming. And so Plan Frontera Sur was announced by Mexico as a way to control the movement of Central Americans across that country and to, quote, protect the human rights of those individuals, which obviously we know has had the complete opposite effect. What ends up happening with U.S. support, and we've got tons of U.S. Border Patrol in places like San Pedro Sula and Mexico City, helping these governments to stop this flow of people. We've helped them turn places like southern Mexico into scenarios that now look like southern Arizona. So overnight in Mexico, you have dozens of temporary checkpoints popping up, enormous large checkpoints, permanent ones popping up, hundreds of new agents, federal agents on the ground looking for Central American migrants. And at one point, this enormous rise in deportations of Central America, to the point where Mexico starts to out-deport us, right? And we are the great deporters of the Western Hemisphere, and now Mexico is deporting more Central Americans than the United States. The numbers have been difficult to get in Mexico in recent years, and there's been a total denial that Plan Frontera Sur even exists anymore, but it very much still is what is going on. But with pressure from the U.S., we start to outsource our security to Mexico. And and this is still very much the case. If you look at the numbers of deportations for Mexico, they are on par with us, if not outpacing us. And surprise, surprise, you throw money at this issue, and you increase security infrastructure, and you feed the deportation regime, and then you have a spike in human rights abuses. And of course, everybody's trying to make a dollar now or a peso off of this vulnerable population. And so you've got a steep rise in human rights abuses, both at the hands of Mexican officials as well as transnational criminal organizations, and of course a rise in the cost of smuggling. And some of the most egregious human rights violations that I've ever witnessed in person were at the hands of Mexican immigration officials against Central Americans. And in my previous work, I had argued that the U.S. that the Arizona desert and is really America's border. That we use the natural environment to slow down the movement of migrants. And we've now done that same thing with Mexico. So we've turned Mexico into another border wall for Central Americans and have outsourced all kinds of, whether it's using nature, forcing migrants to walk through dense jungles, or forcing them to deal with gangs and robbers and corrupt Mexican immigration officials. We are now using Mexico to slow down our Central American migration problem. And and this is all very much relevant now into this discussion of the quote-unquote migrant caravan, but hundreds, thousands of people moving in mass across Mexico, trying to get to the U.S.-Mexico border to ask for asylum, and moving in these large groups not because they like to party with big groups of people, but because they think that there's safety in numbers. And we tend to see these kinds of sensational images of people storming the gates. And I just want you to know that the folks who are really coming across right now, even in these large groups of people, they're coming on in overpacked vehicles, people sleeping on the floor in between seats. They're walking for great distances where they are having to sleep outdoors for extended periods of time. I'm not even sure where they're getting these tents from, probably from donations, because many of these folks are sleeping just on cardboard, sheets of cardboard with whatever meager possessions they have to stay warm. But this is what the caravan looks like, this desperate group of people, and many of them small kids traveling with their parents. And these are all images taken from the most recent caravan by a family group that I work with that was moving with the group. So just something to keep in mind that this current crisis is all connected to these issues of Plan Frontera Sur, as well as this increase in the use of smugglers and the rise in the cost of smuggling. And so it is very much a U.S.-produced problem, much like many of the other factors that are pushing people out of Central America. These are all U.S.-induced problems that I'm happy to get into more in the Q&A. Okay. Now, before I can, excuse me, I live with a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, so the disease vectors in my house run directly to me, and I've been fighting a cold for about a week now. But before I can get into the kind of nitty-gritty about smuggling, I have to answer an important question, which is why photograph? Because I've just come up here and I've told you I'm doing a photoethnography on the lives of Honduran smugglers, which should immediately raise a bunch of ethical questions, if not a series of red flags. Because I can promise you it sure as hell does for me and continues to raise lots of red flags. And I ask myself, how does one do research ethically in this context where drugs and violence are the norm? That is the everyday. That is part of the job description. Why try to photograph this organized chaos? What is gained, and what is, more importantly, what is potentially lost or put at risk when these lives are captured on film? These are questions that I have struggled with since I began this project. And my interest in smuggling, I think, grew, for me, is a logical extension from the previous work I've done with the Undocumented Migration Project. I've been interested in border security, in clandestine movement, and I think in the first book, the things that were missing for me was more of a discussion about gender, more of a discussion about smuggling, and more of a discussion about border patrol. And so this book is trying to deal with all three of those issues. However, my questionable ethical and methodological decision to photograph smuggling also really grew out of my previous interest in trying to visually document the migration experience in hopes of finding some new way to present this old and poorly understood phenomenon. And maybe also to open up the work to an audience that doesn't want to read ethnographies but can respond more to the visual. And I've taken a lot of cues from my very brilliant colleagues who have been working with photography for many years now. And one particular quote that I like comes from the work of Jeff Schoenberg and Philippe Bourgois in their book Righteous Dope Fiend, where they had spent almost a decade photographing homeless heroin injectors in San Francisco to understand the brutality of their lives. And Jeff and Philippe write, quote, "For them, long-term ethnographic relationships that combine text with photographs can create a medium that is more than the sum of its parts, analytically, politically, and aesthetically." And I truly, truly believe that when you put these things into conversation with text, that the photos can do a hell of a lot of work that maybe the text couldn't do by itself. And in many ways, the text rescues the photograph from being misinterpreted. But I also oftentimes, when I'm asking myself, why am I taking pictures, I think about the notoriously elusive street photographer Gary Winograd, a curmudgeon who hated to answer questions about why he took pictures. And on those rare occasions when he did respond to that question in a Q&A, he would say to the person, "Well, why do I photograph? I photograph, I guess, to find out what something will look like photographed by me," which is a totally not helpful response. But I think in some ways that's kind of the one that I'm struggling with too, is can I visualize this troubling, complex world in some kind of new, nuanced, and perhaps meaningful way? I don't know, but I'm working on it. And I do know that when photography is taken seriously, something which I've only recently done in the last 3 or 4 years, really thought of it as a method, I do think that when we give it deep anthropological thought, we can push the boundaries of what ethnography can look like, but maybe more importantly, what it can feel like. So for me, the camera has become a crucial fieldwork tool, not just to make data, but as a form of ethnographic practice that is shaped by and reflects my own position and understanding of the world, both my own world and those I'm seeking to understand from the outside. These photos that I take are not meant to just illustrate the text, although occasionally they play that role. I take pictures, I think, to document moments of light, time, and action. I'm taking pictures to remember or to catch things that I didn't see with the naked eye. I photograph to provide partial glimpses of very difficult to access worlds. I take pictures because I know that there are some things that cannot be conveyed in words. And so I guess my photoethnography is not just me taking pictures of smugglers to illustrate words that I'm going to write later on. I'm trying to make new layers of understanding through the use of visuals that can complement, contradict, complicate, and in some cases undermine the ethnographic authority that I claim to own by writing down and theorizing the things that I've seen and heard in the field. Margaret Mead once wrote, writing about ethnographic fieldwork, she once wrote that it begins in a state of naivete, and then your observations become increasingly more relevant with time. But then she argued the counter for photography. She said, but photographs are different. They provide a constant and steady record of human behavior, and it's not naive in the beginning, nor experience at the end. It just was. It just is. Photographs, for her, she argued, could function as a, quote, automatic correction on this variability of the human observer, whose cultural understanding maybe is slow in the beginning. But I want to argue the complete opposite today. I want to argue that my photoethnographic practice that I'm going to talk to you about has evolved alongside my understanding of smuggling. And I don't claim to present any truth today. There's no facts that I'm trying to present, but rather just my changing vision. And in addition, unlike a photojournalist, which I've been accused of being as of late, and I'm happy to, I've been accused of being all kinds of stuff lately. Artist, that's not in a good way. Photojournalist is another one, not in a good way. But I don't take offense to those things. If you want to call me a journalist or a photojournalist, I think it means I'm committed to storytelling. But this is not photojournalism. This is actually quite the opposite. I put the camera down a lot. There's no one shot that I'm looking for. And more importantly, with the camera and with this work, I want you to know that I was there. And I was uncomfortably close to people oftentimes, and then everybody in the room could kind of feel it, especially when it came down to releasing the shutter on that camera. And I guess in many ways I find kinship with the documentary photographer Eugene Richards. who, when he writes about his own photographic practice, he says, look, I use a 35 millimeter lens, which he says, it forces me to get close to people. If I want to see their face up close with a 35 millimeter, I have to get close to them. He says, I don't use a telephoto lens. I want something that allows me to get close, forces me to get close. He says, when I shoot with a 35 or with a wider 28 millimeter and beyond, which starts to distort the image, oftentimes you can see the lens, it's bending on the edge of the glass and making the picture seem wavy on the outskirts. He says, I like that because it reminds me that this photograph is not wholly real. The deformations that happen, the distortions that happen, he says, they're expressionistic. And he says, I like that element because it's a reminder that I'm just a recorder of this thing. And that by being there, I am changing the things that are happening. These disturbances, the people staring back at you, the distortions, they remind you that this is a filmic experience. This is not real life. And for me, that is a crucial thing to constantly remember. I'm not looking at migrants through a magnifying glass. I'm there, I'm trying to be with them. And so the stuff I'm going to talk about today is very much a work in progress, but I find it helpful, both intellectually and ethically, to talk about these things with you. And I sort of look at this audience as my cheap group therapy. So I can just be an oversharer, which I very much am about this whole process. And I think I really have to be to keep doing it, because I'm constantly worried about this work. And the moment I stop worrying about it is when I should stop doing it. So I think nowadays I really want to be the Larry David of anthropology. So it's like, oh my God, should I be doing this? Oh my, and I just to a level of obnoxiousness that you're like, just get over with it. But for me, I've fully embraced that reflexivity. And so what I'm going to do today, talking about photography, is I'm going to, hopefully John Sarcophagus is not rolling over in his grave, but the photo curator who had an enormous influence on American photography in the 20th century, and really put forth this argument that there were 5 main themes of photography that we should be concerned with: the subject, the detail, time, frame, and the vantage point. I'm going to take those things and flip them on their head. I'm going to overly complicate them like a good anthropologist. And by isolating these elements, is what I'm about to do, I'm not trying to ignore the cultural, political, or the social context where these pictures were made, which is what people have argued Sarcophagus was doing when he came up with this schematic. But I want to do the quite opposite. I want to give insight into each one of these things and highlight how difficult and complicated their relationship is with visual documentation and representation. And I want to think about technical and compositional decisions as not being apolitical. And I want to think about how to be ethically aware and reflexive when I use the camera. So let's get started. The thing itself, subject. Sarcophagus writes, quote, "Photography deals with the actual," end quote. And so I'm like, man, that does not help me at all. Especially when you're trying to photograph something as murky and shapeless as human smuggling. A simplistic explanation of the social process that I could give you would be something like, smuggling involves paying a smuggler to transport you illegally across an international boundary. But the problem is that it doesn't capture the complexity of this social process. It's dynamic, it's multi-layered, et cetera, et cetera. Moreover, describing or trying to photograph a typical smuggler is problematic and akin to making photographic representations of cultural or racial types. There's no one kind of smuggler, and no person is only a smuggler. These folks live complicated, dynamic, interesting lives, and their communities are diverse and dynamic. In these communities, you have the OGs, the intense dudes, the sicarios, the assassins, And then there's the wannabes, the hangers-ons, the junior soldiers, the people who Warlock likes to boss around like children, gophers who go on drug and grocery runs to make fun of, and in this case, anthropologists to make fun of, to go on grocery runs. And then there's other folks in these communities, in these settings, that work the more straight jobs, people that you rely upon to fix your Mexican visa papers or to pick up money from Western Union because they've got a clean ID. Those who physically guide migrants across Mexico tend to be men. But there are plenty of women in this community who have their own hustles, some of them legal and some not. There's also a lot of kids running around, kids just being kids. Everyone is constantly moving and trying to make ends meet. Gangbanging, smuggling, and the migrant communities in Mexico are superimposed onto one another. Now, obviously, anthropology, if you've spent any time looking at the discipline, we have a long and tortured history of photographing our research subjects. It's thus no surprise that few of us, ethnographers, publish portraits of the people that we work with, despite the fact that we all bring cameras into the field. When we do publish photos of people, their pictures are often totally absent, their faces are totally absent, composed in such a way that individuals appear as abstract figures or headless, or their faces are blurred out, or, my favorite, we make it look like they're wearing VR goggles. Seldom do we, the ethnographers, do we take people seriously when they say that they want to look back at the viewer. And I think this is partly because we, anthropologists, we don't know what the hell to do with portraits. We don't know how to interpret the meaning of a portrait. And it makes us uncomfortable when the other gazes back. Elizabeth Edwards has summarized this feeling in a really, I think, succinct way when she's talking about our 20th century preference for trying to photograph people looking natural. And I myself have been very much guilty of this, trying to get people to look natural, stop posing, and having to kind of overcome that. She says, in the 20th century, so much of it was this idea that when people look into the camera and they look back at us, this self-conscious representation, well, it's troubling because it marks the presence of the subject, the author, and the viewer, and it challenges our authority as anthropologists. It disrupts this immediacy, the spontaneity, and the naturalism, the supposed naturalism on which our observations are supposed to be grounded upon. And I completely agree. It's an illusion that we think that we're looking at something at the real world. And I think photography oftentimes can perpetuate that. In the 21st century, we generally defer to that thing we call the Institutional Review Board to tell us what we can and can't photograph. We remove our interlocutors from any discussion about the reproduction of their likeness. We act as if these people who we are taking pictures of, who live major portions of their life on the internet just like us, we act like they don't understand the global circulation of images, including their own. When I took this picture of Lester, he said to me, "You're going to show this to gringos?" And I said, "Yep." He says, "All right, I want you to tell them one thing. Tell them that we migrants have our drinking well controlled." So I always find it's much better when those guys write their own captions. But honestly, I think, by not publishing the pictures of the faces of people that we work with, we keep our, quote, informants, or whatever we call them these days, we keep them invisible as if we're somehow protecting them from the evils of the outside world. And it's very rare that we take them seriously when they say, "I want to be seen. Take my picture. Show my face." And so I've tried to take that request seriously these days. Now, obviously, if you go down to southern Mexico at this moment, there's no shortage of desperate young Honduran men on the migrant trail. Young men, young women, kids. People fleeing violence, poverty, and death in search of something better, or at least safer. Some of these folks will make it north and try their luck crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. Some will stay in Mexico and try to make ends meet as an undocumented worker or asylum seeker. Others will find easy money through the attractive world of smuggling. And those who take on this occupation will come through it via all kinds of routes, no pun intended. Because of the increasing involvement of transnational gangs in this process, I have become interested in gangbangers turned guides, people like Warlock and his crew, as well as the disenfranchised and highly vulnerable youth from Central America who get involved in smuggling because of the easy money, which by default gets them involved with gangs. So let's meet some folks. Chino. If Warlock is a king, as Hondurans will often call each other as a form of endearment, rey, well then Chino's a foot soldier, a soldado. A young man who left Honduras when he was 17, the wildest of many children being raised by a single mother in a dirt floor house with no running water. He figured he was way more help to everyone if he was out of the picture. One less hungry belly to worry about. He spent much of his teenage years getting in trouble on the streets of San Pedro Sula and then later riding the rails across Mexico. He's just recently turned 20 years old, and he and I are sitting on a rickety bench on the train tracks in the southern Chiapas town of Pacalna when he starts talking to me about the cyclical and endless journey that he's been on. He says to me, I've ridden the train a lot, coming and going, coming and going. They catch you, immigration, they'll send you right back to Honduras. But you learn and you go around that place the next time. And I say, well, how many times have you tried to cross the U.S.-Mexico border? He's like, man, like 5 times. Once I got across and I was hiding in a tree in Laredo, Texas. It was incredible. I climbed up into this tree and I put some wood up there to lay on. He says, I had my bottle of water and my backpack tied up there, I had my cigarettes and my lighter. I was in my little house, in my little casita, he says. I slept up there at night. He says, man, I was sleeping in that fucking tree for 8 days, laughing. But seriously, immigration would come through the woods looking for me, but they couldn't find me. They didn't see me. Chino was up there, and Chino loves to talk about himself in the third person. He says, Chino was up there in the tree. They couldn't see Chino. And then he says, and then they caught Chino coming out of a 7-Eleven. He says, man, I was in Texas for like a month. But the problem is, you get across that border, and then what? Where are you going to go? On the street. That's where. After failing to join America's undocumented labor force, Chino fell into work in the train tracks as a soldier for MS-13, as a guide. He had developed the necessary skills for this type of work during his involvement in various gang and criminal activities in Honduras. But he had become disillusioned with the violence that he was participating in in his home country. He explains to me why he left, quote, I could go back to Honduras if I wanted to, but I would have to kill people. I could go back and I could have women, cash, and drugs. But I have to kill people whenever they told me to. I don't want to live like that anymore, he says. This is the typical story of young guides, soldiers. Kids who attempt to migrate to the U.S. and fail and find it much easier to connect up with a gang and see if they can make it work. What does it mean for a photoethnography of undocumented migration and smugglers if we're afraid to show it people themselves? The portraits I make of these individuals in the midst of their dangerous journeys and violent occupations are anything but clandestine. These folks pose for the camera. This is how they want to present themselves to an imagined audience. They hope that you'll look at them, and maybe by seeing their face, a face like Chino's, and experiencing his direct gaze, you'll be forced into what Ariella Azule calls a social contract with these individuals. A relationship that we can form with those who stare back at us. In other words, she argues, might open up possibilities for action and new forms of visibility, which we as a viewer might find difficult to ignore. Now, the subject of smuggling, this is impossible to reduce to a single image, but I think its ambiguity and complexity can be felt if we stare hard enough and long enough. But for this social contract, for you to have one with Chino right now, for it to be effective, I have to sell you on Chino. Chino the person, Chino the worthy ethnographic subject. His gaze has to be contextualized. This social contract has to be clarified. And I struggle with how to visually represent Chino and his complex experiences. Unlike veterans like Warlock and Priest, he can still get out of this life. He's only a few years into being a soldier and potentially could find some stability and a way out. Can he be photographically reduced to smuggler, or in this case a soldier with a simple caption? Yeah, probably. I could also photograph him in the shadows and out of focus, like I do with Warlock. Try to give him some mystique. Maybe I can make him look wild, as he occasionally behaves. How do I visually represent my friend Chino, the soldier, the drug addict, the young man who boasts of having killed people? The kid who intimates to me on multiple occasions that his favorite part of smuggling is when he trades women his, quote, protection for sex. The kid who also intimates to me that he himself sells his own body to make money and to survive. Or do I tell you all these things and then show the smiling and optimistic face of a vulnerable youth caught between violence and poverty at home and violence and poverty on the migrant trail. I don't know what the hell to do with that. The detail. Sarcophagus writes, quote, "The photographer is tied to the facts of things, the facts. And it was her problem to force the facts to tell the truth." I've helped him with his pronouns, someone who was notoriously favorable toward the male photographers and not so much to female photographers, so I fixed the text for him. She could not, outside the studio, pose the truth. She could only record it as she found it, and it was found in nature in a fragmented and unexplained form. He says, the photographer could not assemble these clues into a coherent narrative. She can only isolate fragments, document them, and by doing so, claim some special significance, a meaning which went beyond simple description. In other words, what he's trying to say, I think, is that the photographer selectively chooses details and then makes a case for their significance. This sounds a lot to me like some people's perspectives on ethnography. I would prefer, though, to think about photoethnography as an endeavor that is simultaneously retrospective. It freezes a moment, but also collaborative. Perhaps what Tim Ingle would call a work in progress. People making themselves visible, and the person behind the camera making technical and aesthetic decisions about that moment. The image is retrospective and an active collaboration. And maybe it's a collaboration that continues, as Azulay argues, into real time every time these photos are viewed. Now, mid and low-level Central American smugglers in Mexico have relatively short lifespans. Being in his early 30s makes Joker much like Warlock, a veteran, an OG, a survivor. It helps that Joker is charismatic and funny. Every time I visit him, he laughs and says he's going to tie me up and take my shit when I try to leave. I'm pretty sure he's joking most of the time. But over the years, he's taught me a lot. I now know how to make homemade body armor in preparation for a prison riot. I've increased my lexicon of Spanish words for sex organs and drugs. I've also learned what questions not to ask him. Joker is animated, especially when he is partying, which is oftentimes most of the day. I've never seen anyone mime a knifing with so much conviction or improvisation, and you'd be surprised within the course of a 2-hour conversation how many times you would need to reference knifing someone in some way, shape, or form. And it's in those particular moments with Joker that I can't tell if I'm looking into the past or the future, and I've gotten to the point where I don't think it matters. Now, in the field, I shoot with a battered 35mm black Nikon F2 camera. It's a camera covered in electrical tape to make it less conspicuous, and also to lower its estimated resale value. When I shoot color film in the jungles of Chiapas, I oftentimes use Kodak Ultramax 400 negative film. It's the cheapest 35mm film that Kodak currently makes. I prefer its vibrancy to the more muted colors of film like Kodak Portrait. Kodak Portrait reminds me of middle-class American wedding photos. And so if you can have the hipster wedding package where someone will photograph your wedding with analog film, and typically Portrait is the go-to because of its sort of airiness and its tones. This is, by the way, not a middle-class American wedding photo. But for me, Kodak Ultramax, it distorts. It has a higher grain quality and clarity that I think you just don't get with lower ISO films or with more expensive films like Kodak Portrait. For me, this particular film breaks up like an overdriven tube amp, and it does a good job, I think, of capturing the overpowering color and the brutal sunlight of southern Chiapas. It's sun that I find can sometimes make your teeth hurt and your body ache. The saturation and grain structure also convey a certain ethnographic tone for me. And I think more importantly, it works well with darker skin compared to Portrait and other films that make brown and black people oftentimes appear yellow, or ashen. Cultural critic Lorna Roth has written extensively about the racialized color balance and dynamic range of Kodak films. Films that she said took years to correct, and only after candy vendors and furniture makers complained that Kodak film stocks weren't accurately capturing the differences between milk chocolate and caramel or mahogany and oak. They could care less that working class African American communities and Latinos were looking bizarre with the current Kodak color stocks. And this is a Kodak Portrait. It's hard to see here in this image, but his hands are super blown out and kind of ashy, and same thing with the side of his head. That's what the film emulsion does. It was only later on, after people started complaining, these manufacturers started complaining, that Kodak and these other manufacturers acknowledged, well, that the problem was the fact that all of these film stocks were calibrated for white skin, which is why non-white skin often looks bizarre or detailless in old-timey photos. Some Kodak executives refused to discuss race in the context of what these emulsions were good for. They just didn't want to talk about it. But Kodak Ultramax has subsequently been marketed for working class communities of color. And you can see here too another example of Portrait, where all the details on his chest it looks like he's covered in powder. And I can confirm when I started this project in 2015, it took me a long time to figure out what the hell was wrong with these, either my exposure or with if it was the film. And it was in fact because much of this film was not, it just didn't work well for darkly colored skin. And it took a lot of experimenting, a lot of money to figure out that the best film to shoot darker skin was the cheapest film. Well, let's get back to Joker. Joker loves when I take his picture, and that's usually why he lets me get right up in his face when I put a macro lens on my f2. I hope this one ends up in your book, bro. Am I gonna be on the cover, bro? Constantly. Now, Joker spends most of his time outdoors and shirtless, which means he's permanently tanned a golden brown. His body shows the colorful wear and tear and the handmade markings of someone who has made a living for years on train tracks and other places where an intimidating physical presence is an occupational asset. I shoot black and white photos of Joker in those rare moments we find ourselves indoors, but it never feels completely right. When I render him in monochrome, it's like I'm missing something about his character, his lifestyle, his working environment. I shoot Warlock in black and white because we spend almost all of our times indoors in poor lighting conditions, where color film just doesn't really work. Warlock does not like to leave the house for good reason. He worries about being killed. But also, being black in Mexico means being subject to daily harassment, discrimination, and potential assault by law enforcement and locals. Racism and his personal safety keep Warlock indoors. And these issues also dictate the types of images that I can make of him. But Joker would tell you, hey bro, I don't do indoors. I don't do black and white. And I could tell you many stories about Joker and his fair-skinned crew of mestizo Hondurans and Mexicans, stories that include violence, sex, swindling customers, snorting cocaine, freebasing methamphetamines, and always chain-smoking weed. Those are the details that people expect to hear about coyotes. They are, of course, interesting and important details, but they don't completely define those who undertake this dangerous occupation. Because Joker loves to talk about his family. I love my kids, bro. I love my kids, he tells me as he kisses the invisible rosary on his neck and points to the heavens. He then produces numerous digital cell phones that store pictures of his toddler son. He then pulls his wallet out to show off transaction receipts that record the money that he sent home to pay for diapers, medicine, and food. It's money made from smuggling people and sometimes ripping them off. People that I have trust told me that my friend Joker is a very, very bad person. And yet every time I speak to him on the phone, he ends our conversation by saying, God bless you, bro. Time. I'm running long on time. I'm going to speed this up a little bit here. Time on the migrant trail cannot be accurately measured with a watch or a calendar. This is because it has its own sociocultural logic. It contracts and it expands in response to social forces and the complex spatial dimensions of this world of clandestine movement. But right now, contrary to what Donald Trump would have us believe, migrant time and smuggler time is slow. People are not coming. Everyone's waiting to see what will happen with this current administration. Everyone knows that it's going to pick up again, and when it does, someone like Warlock or Joker will give you just a few hours' notice before you have to be ready. Thank you. Have to be ready to leave your home and perhaps kiss your mother and father goodbye for the last time. Maybe you spend 2 days looking at the lush Guatemalan countryside through a cracked bus window while you quietly repeat your aunt's cell phone over and over and over again. Having that number burned into your brain will be helpful because Mexican immigration officials at the Rio Suchiate, they will steal your wallet, punch you in the face, and take your phone. Out of duress, you will later find yourself saying those same numbers out loud while you're padlocked to a wobbly chair in a muddy colonia on the outskirts of some godforsaken place called Coatzacoalcos. This is because Joker has sold you out to some kidnappers. From where you're sitting, all you can see are the feet of mangy dogs passing outside a crookedly hung door. Is it morning? Is it night? Pain distorts your sense of time, but just keep saying those goddamn numbers. Say anything to make them put the lit cigarettes and the knife away. Sometimes migration time is painfully slow, and other times it's brutally, brutally fast. It contracts and it expands, it stands still and speeds up. It's as fast as a 60-mile-an-hour freight train and as slow as the days it takes for your sister to wire money to pay Warlock to get you to the next stop on the tracks. It's as slow as the long days waiting for new customers or victims on the train tracks. If you're Chino, you kill time by getting a homemade tattoo. You just hope that sharing that needle with 6 other people doesn't kill you later. You pass the days by monitoring the healing process on your catracho tattoo, which is slang for Honduran. And I always joke with Chino, how are you going to pass for Mexican? I don't know. Smugglers and migrants have learned to recalibrate their internal clocks to deal with these wide temporal fluctuations. I think we anthropologists must also recalibrate our clocks to better understand this dynamic social process that has no fixed coordinate and is subject to erratic time changes like a John Zorn composition, just all over the place. This culturally specific form of time, it becomes even more interesting though when you try to photograph it. Do I shoot on burst mode? Do I use a tripod? Does the blur of a slow shutter speed capture the essence of this clandestine movement? Is it possible to find what Cartier-Bresson refers to as the decisive moment on the train tracks? Or should you be looking for something else? What is the opposite of the decisive moment? Sarcophagus writes, quote, "There's no such thing as an instantaneous photograph. All photographs are time exposures of shorter or longer duration. Time is always present." Now, clearly, we scholars of migration recognize that migration is a social process, but we have yet to understand, I think, its dynamic tempos. Because I keep asking myself, how do you photograph migrant time? The frame. A greasy 4-year-old with a poorly sewed hair lip wearing nothing but tattered khakis. He keeps pointing to the camera around my neck and mimicking inhaling glue out of a plastic bag. Keeps pointing at my camera, hoping that I'll take his picture. He's a child Robinson Crusoe shipwrecked on the train tracks. Frankie, the kind-hearted Garifuna smuggler, hitting a crack pipe in a dank cinder block room. The lone window pane has no glass and is covered with a pink blanket decorated with Disney cartoon characters. He turns his back to me and with slight embarrassment declares, "Hey, we all have our vices." My smuggler friend Francisco fighting back the tears in front of a grinning Mexican immigration agent with a potbelly. He musters the strength to tell this agent to go screw his mother as they throw him into a van and deport him back to Honduras. As the van pulls away, I lose my shit and begin to cry inconsolably. Is Francisco's association with me what led to his deportation? Yes. Has he just been sentenced to death in Honduras? I don't know. Images forever remembered without any photographic evidence. Why? Because I could not bring myself to snap a damn picture. I couldn't frame any of these painful or poignant moments. And what does that say then for photoethnography if the most important or difficult moments are the ones that I myself cannot take a picture of? I don't know. But the things we do photograph or do not photograph are oftentimes just as important as what we do. But we rarely get the opportunity to write about the times where the camera was tucked away or the user too paralyzed to release the shutter. We also don't know what to do with a lot of those photos that will never see the light of day. They're out of focus, they contain confusing compositions, they have extraneous subject matter in the frame. Compare these two photographs. This one with this one. Two images made 30 seconds apart with a difference of about 45 degrees in angle. I took the first one on top because I wanted to convey the sense of boredom that often accompanies smuggling. I took the one on the bottom, the second one, because I found it humorous and stereotypical of the boredom that often accompanies field work. On this particular day, my longtime collaborator, Michael Wells, that's not a hipster Honduran, that's a hipster Angelino, taking a nap. He and I had spent close to 7 hours sitting in the same spot with Joker and several others, eating, drinking, napping, talking shit, and finding ways to entertain ourselves. So much time spent waiting for something interesting to happen, for something interesting to photograph. But looking at these two photos for me illustrates a couple of obvious facts. Number one, what makes it into the viewfinder and what is left out is a deliberate decision that changes everything. Framing, in this case, is real-time editing. And looking at what comes before and after that shot provides insight into that editing process. Second, I think this comparison illustrates the supposed nobility that comes with the low-angle portrait and the brutally demystifying impact of the wider frame. When I took this picture of Mike sleeping on the bottom, I never imagined that I would do anything with it. And I'm not sure that he really likes me showing pictures of him sleeping to strangers. But I keep thinking that upon reflection, if I ever do get around to writing a fieldwork manual, this will be the image on the cover. Vantage point, final exposure. I once took a class with renowned LA street photographer John Free, who's a wonderful man. I encourage you to look him up. He's super funny, has great videos on YouTube. But I paid him money to take me around for the day and show me his take on street photography. And one of the things that really stuck with me on that day that I spent with him in downtown LA was he says, you know what, I find it really strange when I see people out on the street and they see something interesting that they want to take a picture of. They stop, they pull their cell phone out, and they just take a picture right there. He says, it's like they decided from where they were standing in that moment that that was the best place from which to take that picture. They didn't think about, like, is there some other way to do this thing? Like, that was it. And that has stuck with me for a long time because I think you could say something similar about the anthropological gaze that we have cast upon the undocumented migration process. An editor of an academic press that I won't shame publicly, but for beers for sure, I'm happy to talk about them. An editor at an academic press once that I had submitted a paper to refused to publish any photos that migrants had taken en route because they were deemed, quote, too blurry. I wrote back, like being a little bit of a smart ass, I said, well, it's probably hard to focus the lens on a disposable film camera because they don't have a lens to focus, and more importantly, framing and being in focus is probably not your number one concern when you're trying not to die or be arrested by the Border Patrol. It got me thinking that, you know, maybe we don't like the migrant vantage point because it calls into question our own anthropological authority. These migrant photos remind us of the arrogance that supposedly comes with participant observation. And as I've argued many times, and will continue to do so, we can never fully participate, no matter how hard we try, nor should we be trying. And maybe we don't like the smuggler's vantage point because it's messy, ambiguous, and not to sound like a broken record, but to sound like an anthropologist, it's complicated. To quote Sarcophagus one more time, he writes, "To a photographer, the world consists of an infinite number of vantage points, places from which to stand, but few of which are altogether satisfactory." He says, the goal is simple in principle and modest in ambition. Find a place and moment from which some aspect of the world can be converted into a photograph that will be both clear and lively. I think for me, increasingly, my favorite anthropological vantage point is the one that highlights the awkwardness of this entire endeavor. For me, ethnographic practice is awkward. And I love it when the gaze turns back on me and highlights that. Because I'm stuck asking myself, how do I deal with this steady hum of anxiety? This constant gaze into a mirror asking if I'm doing the right thing. Am I asking the right questions? Should I be taking this photo? What does my presence do to those around me? Who is gazing at whom? What kind of spectacle am I creating in the field and later when these images circulate? Filmmaker and anthropologist J.P. Sniadecki, he writes about his discomfort with what he calls the token moment, when a researcher, quote, exposes his methods as a way to respond to the ethical complexities and power dynamics inherent in acts of representation. In other words, he calls it, this is like the get out of jail free card. Like, I recognize that photographing other people and representing their misery is problematic, so as long as I say that, I can continue to go on as business as usual. He remarks that, that this self-recognition is just an easy way to brush off these problematic moral entanglements that come with trying to represent the other. And I would say, well, for me, as an anthropologist taking pictures of people caught up in this brutal, brutal process of smuggling, there's no one token moment. There's no one moment of reflection. Just like I can't separate film type from ethnographic tone or from the ethics of representation. Constructing the frame or adjusting the shutter speed is not separate from the messiness of culture. Instead, this photoethnography of undocumented migration should be understood from my perspective. It's one long take, where the technical, the methodological, the theoretical, and the ethical, these things collide and continue to collide long after I've taken the picture. Epilogue. Shortly after I came back from the field in 2015, Chino sent me a picture via WhatsApp. It's a picture that showed him laid out on a hospital bed with a series of stab wounds and a tube draining fluid from his chest. "Look what those bastards did to me," read the accompanying text. Chino had been brutally stabbed by 2 other soldiers on the train tracks after he decided to leave the smuggling game and return to Honduras. He had fallen in love with the girl who he had been charged with smuggling, and the 2 of them decided to return and to leave the gang. The photo that he sent me confirmed what he had told me the last time I saw him. His life was in danger. This was a visual cry for help to someone who had taken his picture many times, me. I wrote back with 1,000 questions. How can I be of assistance? What do the doctors say? Are you going to be okay, man? What's happening? Can I call you back right now? He says, no. Don't call back on this number because I stole it from the security guard, and if he hears it ring, he'll know I'm the one that has the phone. But before we could figure out what to do about his medical options in Mexico, Chino was bandaged up, discharged from the hospital, and put on a bus back to Honduras with no medication or prospect for follow-up care. And I remember it so vividly. It was a bright morning just a few days later after I'd received this photo. The sun was shining on my bare feet as I stared out the window of my Ann Arbor house. And I was looking at my neighbor's annoyingly, perfectly manicured lawn. But I was mentally visualizing a photo I had taken of a goofy-ass kid standing on top of a train, flashing the peace sign and staring back at me. His gaze locked on me. Maybe this one will go in the book that I write about you. It's probably some bullshit I spewed that day to him. But it's this mental image that I have to keep in my mind as I'm playing a voicemail over and over and over again on my phone. And the message is simple. Chino is dead. Chino is dead. I have to visualize that day on top of a train car because the accompanying photo that came to that heartbreaking voice message is too brutal to look at. It's a photo that I don't think I would have been able to take myself. But now, it's a photo that I find that I'm not able to run away from. Thank you.
we've got a few minutes for, man, wow, what a powerful way to end.
I'm
I
sorry,
hope you
like,
know
hardly,
that-
any questions? It's a
Yeah,
hard, like,
it
I'm sorry, it's
seems a
like,
little-
yeah. But I am happy to answer.
Yes, please, let's open it up to questions, comments. Carolyn, yes.
I'll stand up so you project a little higher. It was interesting, the whole range of emotions captured on your photos, and one of the smugglers in the picture, I think we saw priesthood awareness, and camel priesthood. And it's interesting how, this person who's maybe ordering deaths and carrying out extortions and putting people's lives constantly at risk, carries that as their, kind of a hope, thinking, maybe aspiration. And I don't know if I'm curious because I know Latin culture tends to be in general religious. How do they reconcile those views and what they do daily in their work?
It's fun. I've never worked with a more self-righteous group of men than these guys who have strong opinions about how to be a good parent, how to be a good husband, how to do the right thing, and at the same time, how to dismember a body, how, when it's okay to kill someone, kind of thing. And it's a complicated thing that goes back and forth. And I'm constantly asking about that. How can you claim to be a Christian when you're doing these things that are seemingly unchristian-like? And oftentimes the response is, that's just work. This is for money. This, and better, if it wasn't better them than me, they would do the same thing to me. And so people find all kinds of ways to justify that. But then at the same time, I've been in safe houses where, with some of these men who are, like, will berate a woman about what they deem to be, like, not being a good kind of mother. And it's just these contradictions that come back and forth are really interesting and difficult to kind of wrap my head around. But even there's a picture of someone reading a Bible. He's getting ready to go on this trip. They're all carrying religious items and using religion in interesting ways. And part of it too is like using it to further these activities that would be deemed kind of unchristian-like. So there's this kind of hybrid use of religion in those contexts as well. But for me, the fact that a lot of them are so religious is an interesting point, I think, highlights to the complexity of them as individuals.
In the Land of Open Graves, you mentioned that part of the reason you were able to speak on women's roles was partially just due to access. I was wondering if you have anything you could speak on in terms of maybe women or gender relations that you noticed, or whether or not you were able to kind of engage in that dynamic.
So this project is really about hypermasculinity, and that's partly because I had the most access to men. And these are super gendered spaces. So like we go to a safe house and men are in one room, women are in another room. Women show up in this new book project more than before. I worked with a family group, a mom, a boyfriend, and 2 kids who are smuggling and doing various kinds of things. And so I'm able to, she plays a big role. Chino's girlfriend, who had been migrating at the time, I worked with her for many years, and so I'm trying to get at least some perspective of how women are thinking about smuggling in this context. But when I tried to get more access to women smugglers in this context, it was always really challenging. And the men would be suspicious, like, oh, we knew it, that's why you're here, is to take our women, kind of thing. And the women also knew that the men were really trying to control these spaces in this sort of problematic kind of gendered ways, where there'd be funny moments where I'd be sitting around with a bunch of guys and a woman would come in and say, when you're done talking to these idiots and want to know the real stuff, come over here and talk to me about it, because everything these guys are telling you is just utter bullshit, which was true a lot of the times. And I would try to kind of figure out ways to access that info, but it turned out to be really challenging, especially because I wanted to work with the higher kind of crew chiefs, who those crews tend to be all men. But women would show up in safe houses. They oftentimes control the space where people are sleeping. They're taking the rent. They are arranging for money pickups or grocery runs and that kind of stuff. With the family group I work with, gender for her and having kids with her was really important to create a false sense of trust with people, so then she could kidnap them or sell their information to sort of smugglers. But I tried really hard to access those things, and it just ended up that these men were the ones who really controlled everywhere that I went. And it ended up being so dangerous that I really couldn't push back about like, hey, I want more access to this kind of stuff. I had to really listen to what these guys were going to, take what they would give me kind of thing. And much of that meant them controlling this whole scenario. And I think part of it too is they know that the women would be quick to undermine this sort of veneer that they were working so hard to maintain. The fact that, I've got the money, I have control, I'm really scary kind of thing. They're constantly on to present that, and discussions with women would quickly undermine the fact that these guys, were not what they seemed to be. And so, I was able to kind of see that from different perspectives slightly, but really not as much as I would have wanted to. But I still know that these guys, I was able to see moments of vulnerability that just confirmed what I was sort of hearing from other people as well.
I guess I wanted to ask, as the calculus that people have been operating with, I was thinking about your statement or the stories of people asking to have their photographs taken in southern Mexico. And I'm wondering, as the calculus has kind of changed over the last half decade or so, to what degree the more vulnerable migrants want or don't want visibility. As far as I understand it, a shift from the default of as secret as possible to now seeing some instances where people want higher visibility in order to have greater safety or in order to denounce what's been occurring or things like that. As that shift has happened, have you had any opportunity to either reflect on or hear directly from those that control the route or those, the smugglers, either south or north, about what they think about that shift, either in terms of how much money they've lost as a result by people not buying padres anymore, or in terms of whether they feel like their corresponding desire for visibility has changed as there's a lot more eyes, as the militarization has increased, whether they want more or less visibility themselves as people who are accused of being persecutors. I guess I'm curious about that.
Excuse me. That's a good question. It feels like the more vulnerable, the more take my picture kind of thing. I mean, because people oftentimes use it as a way to make a stronger case for asylum, for showing their family, look, I was on the news, this is how bad things really are. And I think with the smugglers, there's not so much, they're sort of more ambivalent about it in general. And I think many of them, they're of a generation where they're hyper visible anyway, right? I tell Warlock, I'm like, dude, you should really take down your Facebook page, truly. And some of those pictures are from his, he finally made it private, but for a time I was like, you're basically, everything you do is being captured in real time, to the point even occupation listed smuggler, just crazy kinds of stuff. But a lot of those guys, I think, they're of an age where for them the hypervisibility is an important part of performance. And then the older sort of guys become a little bit more cautious, or they age out and go on to do other stuff. But this kind of generation 15 to 25, they're not super concerned about identity. And we talk about facial recognition software, that kind of stuff, and they just really seem to not care so much. But I typically don't show those guys. The ones who I think the most vulnerable, the smugglers, I tend to never show their pictures. And I don't even, and really here, in general, with our the last 10 years, we've actually rarely shown portraits of people. The first book had very few in it. We've just done an exhibition, which for the first time in 7 years of doing that work, we started to show portraits. But we, trying to be pretty cautious about that stuff, and then really only with folks who aren't connected to some other story that I'm talking about. So any portrait that I show has no connection to an individual that is named. So I'm still kind of working some of that in, at least my kind of my own personal IRB kind of thing. But that's a lot of juggling and constantly changing as people are using photography more and trying to be more visible. I'm actually Facebook has changed, and the adoption of smartphones have really changed how people remember and capture these experiences, to the point where, I don't think anyone's actively archiving Facebook for these images, but you can just go and see this stuff happening in real time, both from the smugglers and from migrants.
Do you have a sense of their reaction to that, the economic losses or the potential
I think that those are kind of one-offs, and that and there are smugglers in the caravan, right? So it's not. I think that they're still making money off of this stuff, and they see the caravans as little blips on the radar. Things will go back to normal because you can't do it forever, and it takes a lot of steam to kind of do it. And there's still lots of other folks who don't want to go that route. And even the caravan itself is not that safe. I mean, people get kidnapped all the time, singled out. So there are other folks who are still very much willing to pay money. And so, but smugglers are, they're constantly finding new ways to profit off of this. We were talking about this morning. They're charging people $500 to cut in line at the U.S.-Mexico border to apply for asylum. So, even in places where you think, why would I need a smuggler for this? They've found a way to insert themselves and profit.
Let's have one last question.
Yeah, so going back to the stores, the political crisis that is producing the migration, I was wondering if you could give like a short synopsis of what's happening right now in Honduras and where it's headed.
Well, I think Honduras, it's seemingly growing economically for some people, but I think it's not for everybody. And so, before, like 3 years ago, the primary list of it's always poverty. I mean, poverty is always a thing that people are not able to make a living. The violence that's been happening there over the last 5-6 years has just made it impossible. I mean, people literally, are dying when we're deporting them back and they're being murdered on the street by, for no reason other than they're not paying the gang that's controlling the neighborhood, whatever tax that they've put, or they're being singled out by even these anti gang militias that have formed to counteract MS-13, who are not picking on any teenage kid in a baseball cap kind of thing. So I think the day-to-day violence is the number one factor pushing folks out. But at the same time, droughts. Every time a hurricane blows through, and increasingly that's going to make things worse. A lot of those factors are leading stuff. But I think right now, you ask these folks, the number one reason for leaving is because they don't want to die in Honduras. And folks will say, look, I'd rather be cut in half by a train in Mexico than be shot in the back by a stranger on the corner in San Pedro Sula, because at least in Mexico I've made a conscious decision to control part of my destiny. And so if that happens, at least I was in control, as opposed to the random violence that people are fleeing from.
So, thank you very much for coming. Next week is Haiti Week. Keep your eyes open for a number of events around Haiti. And 1 week from today in this very room, we're having the Indigenous Uses of Digital Media Conference. Jason, thanks so much for
Thank you.